Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have about 100 people now participating in this session, which is fantastic, and I'm sure some more will be joining us as we go on, so we'll just get started. Welcome to this Nesta Talks To event today with Professor Paul Ramchandani. My name is Adam Lang. I'm the head of Nesta in Scotland, and it's my pleasure and privilege to host this session today. Nesta, for those of you who don't know, is a global innovation foundation, and we aim to bring bold ideas to life that change the world for good. Our Talks To series is an informal conversation with some of today's most interesting thinkers, focused on the big topics, the big issues, the big trends that are shaping our future, both here in Scotland, across the UK, and globally. In an age of overabundance of information, it is definitely hard to know how we make sense of the world around us, particularly in these very difficult days that we're living through at the moment, and how we can play a part in shaping our future, how we can shape and imagine a positive future that we can work towards. To guide us towards some of those answers, and of course, almost definitely even more questions, hopefully even more questions, we're talking to today's leading thinkers, community builders, artists, social entrepreneurs, and people working to understand the world around us. Every month, these conversations focus on an urgent topic or something of high sort of importance or topicality, whether that's from mental well-being, inequality, to the climate crisis and the future of humanity and our society. So before I introduce our speaker properly, I'd like to just explain briefly the format of today. We will kick things off with a chat between myself and Paul for the first 20-30 minutes or so, before opening it up to questions from all of you who are joining us today. And I'd really encourage everyone who is in attendance to type your questions into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of the Zoom panel that you should all be viewing from. If you type them in as we go along, we will get to them in the second half of today's session. And I would also encourage everyone to upvote via the sort of thumbs arrow, or the thumbs icon, sorry, the questions that they most want to see answered, because that makes it easier for me in facilitating those to know which to get to first. So as I say, today we are talking to Professor Paul Ramchandani. Paul is a consultant and child adolescent psychiatrist and the Lego Professor of Play in Education, Development and Learning at the University of Cambridge, where he leads a team researching the role of play in children's early development. I have to say that's absolutely, definitely the coolest job title I have ever come across, and I'm really, really looking forward to chatting to Paul. We'll be finding out more about what this all means in just a moment, but first let me say a very warm welcome to Paul, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. So without further ado, we'll crack on with our questions. So for the very first one, Paul, if I may, is can I ask you to explain in your own words what your work involves? What do you do? How would you describe it?
Okay, well, you've already said the title, and what that really involves is that I get to lead a research centre called the Pedal Research Centre, which is focused on play at Cambridge University. So it's a wonderful privilege both to be able to study play and particularly children's development, but also to be part of the environment at Cambridge. The main part is research, and that's studying early child development and play, and I focus mostly on early child development. So we try and do the best quality research that we can do to answer the questions we're interested in, collaborate with a range of other centres in the UK and around the world, and also training others in research methods and research in play, which is one of the nicest bits of the job, training PhD students and other students in the skills needed. So that's the main part of my job, that research component. The other bit, as again you mentioned at the start, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist practicing the NHS. That's a smaller part of my job now than it used to be because the research has become more. So I trained as a doctor, and my whole career has really been spent trying to understand children's development, what makes them tick. And studying play has always been one part of that, but now I get to focus on that much more than I ever did before. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what I do.
Fantastic. It just sounds like such an endlessly fascinating issue. I'm probably quite biased in that I have 3 young children, yeah, I just want to endlessly pick your brains. So let's try and unpick this a little bit. Can you tell me, when you talk about play, what is it that you mean by play and early childhood development? Because I think for some people it might mean different things, or they might have different starting assumptions about what that is. But can you tell us what it means to you and to the focus of your work?
Yeah. Well, if it's okay, if I start it the other way around, and start with the early child development. I mean, I guess everybody kind of knows what early child development is in a way, but I think it's the really, really important part in terms of its for child development, for society, for life in general. It's a hugely important thing, and that became apparent to me, and I'd say it's probably apparent to most of the people listening. But I started my job as a psychiatrist working with adults with mental health problems, and again and again the stories of what was troubling them often had some roots in childhood, and so the importance of childhood kind of became more and more prominent in my work. And I realize it's not a particularly groundbreaking notion that our childhoods are important, but when you hear it again and again from different people from different backgrounds with different difficulties and different troubles, it really starts to make sense. And so I started studying and working with children and families, and increasingly younger and younger, as you realize that actually the threads of this go back and back and back right to the start of life. And so I started learning about the science of early childhood and also undertaking some of my own research. And it was so striking that across the board, whether we're talking about mental health or physical health or other aspects of life, in physical health problems like high blood pressure or diabetes, that what happens to you in early life, and that's during pregnancy and these first few years of life, really can have influences that last for a lifetime. And that's not to be deterministic, because obviously lots of people have difficulties or bad things happen to them in childhood, and that doesn't mean they can't lead a happy, contented, fulfilled life. But if you have a difficult start, it increases your risk for a whole range of problems. And what I guess once you appreciate the importance of that, and once you appreciate that actually you can do things to change that, and you can do preventative and other interventions that make things better for children and improve their life chances, it becomes, I guess, an imperative to do something about that, or to try and do something about it. It also is one of the most fascinating areas of science as well, in terms of the kind of biology and the psychology of child development. So it's a fascinating topic. The scale and the importance of it is staggering. It's also a really interesting area to work in, both scientifically but also kind of practically as well. And play is a really fundamental part of that. So the early childhood, I hope I made the case anyway, it's really important. I can carry on talking on that for hours, but I'll stop just there for the moment. The play bit of it, it's central to most aspects of childhood. If you ask children about what's important to them and what they do and what they like doing, play is always going to come up, almost always going to come up. And it has importance for a whole range of reasons. So we often talk about play and the utility of play, both for helping us to understand children, but also the importance of play for a whole range of aspects of children's development, whether that's social development, emotional development, cognitive development, and so on, or how it might help children therapeutically. Play can help them to process things, can be one of the ways in which they process difficulties. Within that, it's also important to remember that play can also just be fun. It can just be something that children do. It doesn't always have to have that additional layer of meaning, although those meanings are important. So it can just be self-motivated and something that children like to do as well. So that's a sort of starting point for where these things fit together and why they're so important to understand, or so important to do something about.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, then, to the point you made just a moment ago, I think increasingly in our public policy and in our political world, and much of the public services that, both here in Scotland and across the UK, we're definitely seeing a big shift of focus. I don't mean just in the last few years, because it's been topical for a while now, but in a sort of general trend, we've seen a big focus and lots of emerging evidence and fantastic bits of work going on to really focus on early years development, as a sort of key cross-cutting policy, whether it's about health or education, or as you say, mental well-being, and a whole range of other developmental needs and things like improving resilience and things like that in children. So how do we, with your focus on the play element in particular, how do we best understand how, I don't want to sort of overly make the language overly technical, but how do we best understand how different sorts of interventions in that kind of prism of play, or different things that we can facilitate or enable, how do we understand what difference they make? Because I'm still just grappling with this point, but I think play can mean so much and to so many people. I mean, is there such a thing as good play and bad play? Is that a concept, or is any and all play something to be encouraged?
These are questions that verge into philosophy in a way as well. And I'm not a philosopher; I'm quite a practically orientated person. I mean, clearly there are some activities that are not great, but we often get drawn into. Well, I think there's often a tendency to label certain kinds of play as good and certain kinds of play as bad, and older people, and I have to sadly include myself in this now, in that category. Often things that are new and weren't around when we were children are labeled as bad, and the things that we did as kids were somehow good. So, you know, outdoor physical play, being off exploring in the woods is a clearly good play. Sitting playing on a video is clearly a bad kind of play from that kind of terrible characterization. But it's clearly not as simple as that. Like children can get different rewards and different enjoyment and develop different skills in all kinds of formats of play. And one of the things that I suppose I draw on, particularly when working with families of very young children, but I think it applies to children as they get older as well, is thinking about the range and variety of experiences that children can get. So you don't want to be restricting children. You know, children can enjoy fun and exciting play. They can enjoy really calm times with parents, and both of those are important. What we don't want to do is restrict, and you should only be doing this, or you can only do this, or by the environment that we create and the world that we create for children, we hem in their opportunities. So play, whilst it's difficult to disentangle from all of these other bits of life, it gives us a bit of a window into some of the things that are really important for children. And for me, yeah, moving on from the kind of good and bad play and thinking about the opportunities that different kinds of play, whether that's play with their friends, or whether that's play on their own, whether that's pretend play, or whether that's building blocks, all of those things have elements of joy and enjoyment, and elements that children get something out of. So it's trying to encourage that breadth of opportunity, really.
I really want to come on to that point you sort of referenced about the environment and how we create environments, or enabling environments for play. But just before I do, can you tell us just a little bit more from your perspective, and just sort of tease out some of the kind of things that sort of excite you about the long-term effects of a playful childhood? A playful childhood. How are we better understanding the impact that has over the sort of key development milestones in a child's progression? How are you grappling with that? What are we doing at the moment to understand that? And what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, it's a big question, and it runs into that challenge of how do you separate out play from the other aspects of childhood, and in a way you can't. Any separation that you do is slightly artificial, so it can often seem a little bit nebulous. But so maybe if I give kind of just a couple of kind of practical examples that they don't explain the whole picture, but they kind of maybe give a couple of links. So one of the studies that I've been involved with colleagues for a while has been looking at young children's development, and particularly their relationships with their parents, and a lot of that is focused on dads. We've been interested in dad's role in young children's lives, and we followed up a group of families from just after the birth of the child through to when the children were about 2, and we were able to visit them at home. This is about 200 families. We were able to visit them at home 3 times when the children were 3 months old, 1 year old, and 2 years old, and film mums and dads playing with their children, and use a whole range of measures of children's emotional and behavioral and cognitive development. And because we were able to do that kind of detailed filming what was going on, we were able to look at those playful interactions between dads and mums and their children, but just for the purposes of this, focusing on the dads, and able to look then and see, are those early playful interactions and elements of play within those interactions linked to objectively measured behavior and emotion and cognitive development. And we used a standard scale for their cognitive development at the age of 2. And what you see when you do that in this particular study is that there's a clear association from the more engaged dads playing with their kids with better outcomes on the children's behavior, but also on the objective cognitive measures. So like a bit like a baby IQ, that's very bad shorthand, but essentially trying to assess the child's cognitive development in an objective way. these are associations that are happening in the first year or two of children's lives. So it illustrates the importance, but it also shows that there are concrete outcomes to these kind of early interactions that in some ways are a bit nebulous and difficult to measure, but there are clear outcomes. The other example I suppose to give is a wealth of research that's been done on physical play and outdoor play in children's physical health. So the more children have opportunity to be outside and playing and exercising, the better their long-term physical health has been. And there have been a range of studies that have followed up people throughout their lives looking at those kinds of associations. And again, that's partly about play, because play is what children do in the outdoors, but it's also about, obviously, about their exercise, which is linked in with the kind of play that they do. And so you've got two examples there, one on the kind of cognitive, emotional front, and one on the very physical health outcomes like obesity, blood pressure, high blood pressure, and heart disease, and so on, that are both related to things that you can do which link in with play early in children's lives. So that's, yeah, it's just two examples, and play is much more complex than those two examples, but two examples where those early years make a massive difference, and children's opportunities to play in certain ways can make a massive difference to the long-term outcome.
And what's your take on the sort of the culture around it? Because I know we spend a lot of time talking about practicalities and things like that, but do you think culturally in the UK, or just taking the UK as one place, but maybe more generally, do you think we have a good culture at the moment of parents or carers being enabled or being supported to play? I guess what I'm getting at is there's this, you're sort of saying that there's a growing body of evidence and insight and knowledge about the importance of play, and that absolutely chimes with a lot of the things that we at Nesta are aware of in terms of policy environments and policy priorities and practical programs. But how do you think, do you think culturally as a society we sort of recognize it as much as perhaps we should? Do you think we sort of enable and support ourselves to play with our children as much as you think we should, or do you think we've still got a way to go on that front?
I mean, that is a challenging question to answer, because in some regards, children in this day and age have life much better than they did 100 years ago in terms of, you know, life expectancy, their health, the opportunities across the board are very different to how they would have been a century or 2 centuries ago. So in some ways, we're living in a golden age of life for all of us. Maybe doesn't feel it quite at the moment, and the threat of a pandemic, but generally speaking. But within that, there are a few themes that I think worry me and bother me. So I mean, one of the things that we've seen over the last last 10 years or so, particularly, is increased levels of poverty and diminished opportunity for some children, and linking that back to what I said at the start about how early life can have impacts that last a lifetime. Some of that is going to have impacts that affect children now terribly, but also that will have potential knock-ons throughout their life. And so I'm trying to be careful that it's not deterministic. It's not if you have a bad experience or a bad time, you're inevitably going to have a terrible life. But on average, your risks for a whole range of other things do go up if you have a difficult time. So that's kind of one context, the kind of wider childhood, that there is certainly a big group of children who have faced increasing levels of adversity as they've been growing up, and that includes their access to a whole range of different opportunities, not just play, but a whole range of opportunities. So there are some worries in there. That on a kind of maybe on a slightly more minor level than that, children's opportunity for playtime in schools. There's been some nice work tracking that over time by Prof. Baines, I think, and others at UCL, showing that within school opportunities for playtime have diminished in terms of timing. So these are just signals that perhaps we're not taking it as seriously as we can. There's a really nice infographic that I use in talks, and other people do as well, showing how over generations children's opportunity to roam freely has diminished in terms of the area that they can cover. You know, yeah. Going back 3 or 4 generations, not all, but lots of kids could roam for miles, or at least for a mile or 2. Nowadays, children, particularly children living in cities, are often restricted, you know, to the front gate, or certainly not very far beyond that when they're sort of 6, 7, 8. So these, again, that's things that we can do about the environment that make children's opportunity to play and explore and be independent bigger, or we can make them smaller. And certainly we've made it smaller over the last 30 years or so.
Yeah,
that's what the indications seem.
Yeah. So do you know what, on a very personal level, that's something I struggle with as a father. So I grew up in rural Perthshire in Scotland, and it was exactly, I know everyone's got their own nostalgia tinted kind of view of these things, but it was genuinely a kind of front door open, go and play kind of childhood. And I've got 3 children now living in suburbia, and I want the same for them, but I struggle a lot as a father with how to find the right balance. And I don't know what the factors that influence that are, but it's definitely something I recognize from what you're saying is how do you get that risk right? How do you get that enabling environment right?
Yeah.
And if I could ask you about that a little further, so you referenced a little bit of it there, but what is your take on the role of the built environment? Because I think the built environment is a really topical thing. We talk a lot about place-based initiative, whether it, across a whole range of policy areas here in Scotland and I know across the UK. I think we're all grappling with how to connect the sort of national policy ambitions that we have in different parts of the UK or globally with local delivery and local fulfilment of those aims. And I just want, with that in mind, what's your take on, or what's your insight on the role of built environment and children's play?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert on the environment. Most of my work is a lot about children's worlds within their families, but so I think I probably limit myself, at least to start with saying that we kind of choose what we value in how we create the environment. And I mean, it links to what I was saying before. So that includes whether we want to make streets safer by cutting down traffic going through. There's a choice there. There are consequences to that choice, which other people might not like, which many of us might not like. But there are choices there. There are choices in how we design new spaces and create spaces, not just playgrounds, but other places for children to play, and access to those. So I think it has a huge environment effect because it sets the parameters of what is easy for people to, it sets the parameters for the kind of choices that you were talking about. If you live on a busy road with cars going past at 60 miles an hour, you're going to have a very different view about what you're prepared to let how freely you're going to let your children roam at young ages from if you face out onto a field and you kind of, your 6 nearest neighbors. The environment that you're in sets limits, but also sets opportunities. So one of the things that's really struck me over this last 6 months with the coronavirus is actually we have the ability to make some quite stark changes if we choose to. And in a way that hadn't really perhaps occurred to me, maybe I'm naive, but hadn't really perhaps occurred to me before. So I mean, things like seeing homeless, the government saying that homeless people can go and stay in hotels is something that wouldn't have been imaginable before coronavirus. But it goes to show in a way, and there's lots of other changes. People voluntarily locking themselves away for weeks on end. You can make huge societal changes if people choose and if people value certain things. And when you tie that up with the opportunity of the good that we can do if we really take childhood seriously, it encourages me that actually a lot of the things that people will say, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do this for this reason. Actually, many of those are choices that we can make if we choose to take this seriously enough. So it's a bit of I veered off of the question that you asked a little bit there, sorry.
No, not at all, it's fine. I think that's such an important point, and I know at Nesta and many other organisations that we work with and partner with, I think we're all acutely aware of that point of how do we, the ability for bold action, bold thinking is there, and it's just this challenge of keeping things prioritised. And how do you understand what the right things to prioritise are when everything feels urgent, when everything feels like it's a priority. So for your 2 cents, who's doing this well? If we think globally, who's sort of really grappling with this opportunity of recognising play, enabling, encouraging, supporting the role of play in childhood development? Who do you think is getting it right, or perhaps maybe not right, but more right maybe than other places? Who's doing this well?
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit cautious because it obviously depends what you value. Influences how you answer that question. And I think you have to extract lessons from other countries a bit cautiously if you're talking about play, particularly, because play is so interlinked with so many other aspects of life, traditions, the way that countries have traditions around play and activity, and the way they construct their societies. So taking out any one thing, taking out play, or even taking out an education system and saying we should just move this to, whether it's to Scotland or whether it's to the UK more widely, we should obviously do carefully because there isn't any particular magic bullet, but there are hints from other countries and other settings of things that can help. So one of the things to think about is the balance in education in terms of formal versus informal, and when that starts, and that links in with the story, with kind of it links in with play because it's linked in with how play-based we want our education system to be and not be. And as far as I know, there's no evidence that starting formal education earlier leads to better long-term outcomes. Obviously, if you train children for particular things at young ages, they'll be good at those things. But if we're thinking about children's holistic benefit, holistic development, focusing on just one or two things isn't necessarily very helpful. So I think there's lessons we can draw. I mean, Scandinavia is often put up as the kind of example. And I think in terms of their balance for what's the best things to do with education, what's the best things to do with education in the earlier years, that there's a lot that we can learn from them, particularly in terms of how they value childhood and they value the people that work with children. I think that's something that we, and I'm talking about the UK as I understand it here really generally, we tend to not value people who work with children anything like what we should do when we think about the importance of it and the importance for us and for our society. So that's one thing I think we can learn from other countries and other settings, is the value both of children, but the value of those people that work with children and nurture those children from the youngest ages.
I think that's an absolutely excellent point, and I'm absolutely certain that many people on this call today would completely agree with that. So the last question from me before opening it up to Q&A, I can see we've already got a significant number of questions that have been posed, but for me, you sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, COVID-19, the pandemic that we're living through at the moment. It is a huge upheaval in so many ways, socially, economically, people's physical health, mental health, and on every front, it's had a huge impact. How have you seen, or how are you seeing this impact on this issue of play? Is it something that's coming through yet? Is it, or do we think, or are we aware that it's having a negative impact, or perhaps unintendedly a positive impact on children's play? Is there anything that we're seeing so far about how the pandemic is impacting on play in children, or is there anything that's causing you concern as we're sort of looking ahead to the reality that this might be with us for a while, at least in some level? What's your take on that?
So there's a couple of things I think I'd say to that. So thinking about the impact of the pandemic on play, one of the first things that some of the team that I work with did was they did a research, reviewed all the research that they could find on the impact of quarantine and other kind of restrictive environments on children's play, to see if there was research from other previous pandemics or other similar settings that we could learn from and hopefully draw lessons from that would be useful. I mean, there was a disappointing kind of paucity of research in a way, but what it did suggest was that children's opportunities for play and types of play do get restricted in these kind of episodes. So that's the kind of background research, and I think that's what we've seen certainly during lockdown. Obviously, children's ability to interact with their friends was dramatically affected, and that was something I heard in my clinic as well quite frequently, but that the children were missing their friends and their opportunity to play with their friends, and obviously you miss that social interaction. Now that's stuff that hopefully most children can make up over time, but having a significant gap where they're just not able to interact with their friends in the same way. They can maybe, slightly older kids can link up by video, but they can't play the games that they normally would. They can't have the kind of negotiations and disagreements and fights that you have within play that you would normally have with your friends. So that's a huge miss, and that's a huge miss that stopping schools had as well. So I mean, as well as the kind of not learning in the same way, that interaction and that mix within schools, that social mix and opportunities to play, seem to me to be huge miss for children. I mean, school's not great for everybody, and that's the other thing we saw in clinic, that and it's been borne out in some of the studies, that actually some children have felt much better for not having to go to school. So there's a bit of a lesson there about some of the things we might be getting wrong in school for some children as well. There are a whole load of other lessons, I think, but those are a couple that kind of, I think, struck out for me. And the big one, the big other one, was the one I mentioned earlier, that you realise actually in a crisis, the government and the people can do things that would otherwise not be thought possible. And I hope we hold on to that message, that actually you can do things that you wouldn't have normally thought possible if there's an incentive to do it, and if there's a good enough reason to do it.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, an excellent point. Okay, I'm going to try and now, well, I'm going to come now and try and get through as many of these as we can. We've had 19 questions submitted so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these in the order that they've sort of been upvoted, but I will try and get through them all if we can. So the first question, Paul, is from Lewis, who asks, is there any current evidence that lockdown and COVID-19 has affected the amount of play happening with children and young people at homes or school? So I suppose that builds on our point just there, but particularly, is there any evidence that it has affected the amount of play happening?
Yeah, I mean, I refer back a little bit to the answer that I just gave about the existing research. So we the team that I work with did this review, which is we've got a preprint of that available, so that's freely available if anyone wants to see it on the Open Science Framework, and that should be published. Well, I'm hoping it'll be published fairly soon, but we've got a version of it available, so you can see all of the kind of scientific literature that was up to this point. There have been a lot of surveys conducted during lockdown, a lot around kind of family functioning and mental health. Within one of those, conducted in Oxford, a study called the Co-Space study, they have been asking questions about play. I haven't seen the data from that yet, but it should be out fairly soon, which might start to answer. There may be other studies in other parts of the world, but that's a kind of England-based one. So if you look up Co-Space, and the lead investigator on that is Kathy Cresswell, they've got a website where they put all their latest findings up. So there should be something on there. Helen Dodd is leading the research on play, I think, on that one. So hopefully that gives you a starting point for that.
Great, thank you. The next question we have here is from Hannah, who asks, do you think there is a difference between the quality of play experiences for children from different socio-economic backgrounds?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that, because I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question. So
I think it's this. I think it's on this point about the quality of play experience, depending on your socioeconomic background. Yeah. Is there a difference that you've come across in your work in that area? Is it something that trends when we look at it nationally?
So yeah, so I'm trying to think where there's research or data that can draw on that. There is some, and I haven't got it at the forefront of my head, but children's opportunities are hugely influenced by their socioeconomic background. So their access to toys and games within the home, access to people to play with within the home, also the access to spaces outside are hugely influenced by socioeconomic background, and we're seeing that play out in the pandemic. Kids that live in high density cities have much less access to the outdoors and free access to the outdoors than people who live in the country or in better off areas of cities where there's more space. So at a very general level, then yes, there are huge disparities, and those disparities I think are really, really concerning, because we've had decades of research about how inequalities play out in terms of people's development and health and well-being. So as a general answer, then yes, definitely. Specifics, I can't cite you a paper on that, but there are some around.
Thank you. The next question is from Ben. It's sort of linked to that in part, I suppose. What stat or what studies do you always turn to if you ever find yourself having to make the case for how important play is in social, cognitive, and creative development? So what's the killer stat or the killer argument?
I don't know that there's any single one killer paper. I'm just trying to think through if there's been any review. There are a couple of reviews that that cover some of this. There's a whole, I mean, there are a whole range of papers. I'm just trying to think of any that bring it together in one killer blow. I'd have to think about that a little bit more to direct you to one single one. But there's a collection of papers from early child development about parents play and interactions with their children and how important they are for children's development. There's some nice reviews of that. There's another huge body of work about physical outdoor play and the impact on children's physical health. So if you want to email me, sorry, I forgot the name of the person who asked that question.
So this was Ben Templeton.
Ben. Okay, well, if you email me, Ben, then I can dig out a paper or two and send them to you. My email's not on there, but you can look it up. It's fairly easy to find on the internet if you put my surname in Cambridge, but it's pr441@cam.ac.uk.
Thank you very much. Now we've got more and more questions coming in. We've got 24 now, so I'm going to try and we almost certainly will not be able to get through them all because we don't have enough minutes left. But we'll try and get through the top voted ones. Maureen asked a very topical question, which you've alluded to a little bit, I think, already. Can children who have lost out on playful experiences at key developmental stages make up for this later? Is it possible to make up for that shortfall?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is yes, except in really extreme cases. So, but we're talking really extreme cases. So, in the studies of the Romanian orphans from 20 or 30 years ago, where children were living in extraordinary deprivation. So deprivation of play, but also deprivation of nutrition, deprivation from any kind of nurturing care. So in those really extreme cases, even then, some children do well after those environments, but some children don't fully recover from all of the social deficits. But that's really extreme. In most other cases, I tend to, this is very simplistic, but I tend to think of development and how early experience affects development as a bit of a funnel. So if you start with a really good point in life, sorry, I'm doing an illustration for myself, which I realize isn't very helpful. But if we think of a funnel, sort of there with the start of life here at the beginning of my hand, and then going out through life. If you have a really good start in life, your range of opportunities is up here. And if good things happen to you, you're going to end up here. If bad things happen to you, you won't maybe do as well through the rest of your life. If you have a lot of adverse experiences early in life, then your whole range will be moved down, but you still have a huge variability in what can happen. So if you have a bad start but good experiences, you could still end up going up this way, and bad things continue to happen. Obviously, you don't do as well, and that can be for lots of different aspects of life. So life isn't determined at birth, but these early experiences are very influential. That's the kind of balance, I think, that is quite hard to sometimes get your head around, but it's critical to hold in mind.
I think that's a really important point when you talk about what we prioritise, the point you made earlier, how we set bold visions and bold ambitions.
I probably should have brought a whiteboard with me, and then I could have done the
words. We'll definitely do that for the next one. We'll get you back with a whiteboard. So the next question from Paul Liddell. Is there not something about how children are viewed by society? We've seen streets closed to allow pubs to serve adults outdoors, but little about closing streets to allow children to play safely. Is there a clear structural hierarchy? What's your take? I mean, this chimes a little bit with some of the points you were making earlier about the environment the spaces that we have.
I mean, well, my answer to that is yes. I think what we do reflects our priorities, and certainly in the early part of this year, I think our priorities were really disappointing. I understand people making difficult decisions politically in a really difficult environment. I'm a bit of an optimist, so yes, my answer to you is generally yes. But I guess I've been encouraged that over the last, certainly over the last few weeks, an increasing number of politicians in senior positions have talked about how schools have to be the last thing to close, and how we have to think about our children. So there has been a change, I think, in the narrative over the last few months, and a recognition that actually we do have to value children more. But generally, I agree with your point. But if I'm looking for an optimistic train, that's the kind of thread, the optimistic thread that I would take from it, that actually there is something that's got through, even if it's just around schooling, there is something that's got through about children's lives being important.
Thank you. The next question is from Dina. What is the current research focus regarding play? Many educational systems have already incorporated play as a pedagogical approach. Excuse me, I can't speak today for some reason. What would you say, in your take, Paul, is still missing? So lots of people are incorporating this into their curriculums. But what's still missing? What could be done better or more?
Well, there is lots of great practice, and I'm not a teacher, so I'm not going to tell teachers what they should and shouldn't do, because it's not my teaching is not my field of expertise. I think there are some really interesting questions still to be resolved. I think there's an acceptance probably that play, certainly in the first few years from reception class, is important. I don't know about the situation in Scotland, but in England, then there becomes a kind of children enter into a space where it's more about preparing for school and preparing for the kinds of expectations of learning, and their play sometimes gets shoved out a little bit. It varies in different schools and it varies over time, but there are some really interesting questions that we still don't fully know the answer to about the balance between children's autonomy and self-direction and the degree of instruction at different ages for different subjects as we go through. I think we've got some general ideas about that, but there are lots of interesting questions in the detail of how that might work, and in the detail of how it might work differently for different subjects and different age groups. One of my colleagues at the Peddle Centre, Sarah Baker's doing some studies on this, looking at science education in year one with year one children, and what's the balance that's right in terms of children taking on board the concepts and really understanding the scientific concepts, so that they hold that learning and they continue to enjoy that learning through. So there are some really big questions that I think are still fascinating. I'm going to keep people busy for a long time within that.
Great, thank you. We've got another question here from Rachel. It's a two-part. This is a sneaky two-parter, this one. So I have a couple of queries and one comment. Research out there now from PHS/MRC on impact of outdoor space on child's play. Question, is play inhibited through real or perceived risk? So that's one question. Is play inhibited through real or perceived risk? And question two, what have we seen in terms of cultural approaches that support more play for more children? Is there anything to reflect and learn from abroad? So we've maybe touched on some of those questions already, but I think there's still good points. Let's take the first part. Is play inhibited through real or perceived risk?
Very traditional. I'll take the first one first. So I mean, this taps into a little bit about your comment as a parent and how you make these decisions about risk, and so the choices that we make, and then the opportunities that our children have, are massively influenced by perceived risk, not just for themselves, mostly because by the adults that make those choices for them. And we can do things to change the environment, I think, that can change that. So I think it was you, Adam, it might be one of the questions mentioned, no, it's one of the questions, sorry, mentioned safe streets for play. So in some ways, a really simple intervention is really difficult to do, but people in Bristol have done it very well, and I'm sure in other places too. Closing down streets for periods of time so that vehicles can't go on it. And suddenly, children are a massively diminished risk for playing, and so parents can make different choices and feel free to make different choices. So there's a lot of complexity to the kinds of decisions that there are around this generally, but that's one example of something that's quite a simple change that makes a direct impact on parents' choices, and then that makes a direct impact on what's available to children in that time.
Thank you. Just the second part there that Rachel asked is, what have we seen in terms of I really can't speak, sorry. What have we seen in terms of cultural approaches that support more play for more children? Is there anything to reflect and learn from abroad?
That's a big question to answer. For me, it's I'd say play is tied in with so many aspects of childhood that this is tied in at least in part with how we value childhood. And so if we value children's experiences and the opportunities for children, then we will make different choices from if we don't really value those, or if it's a minor consideration. Can I give one Scottish example?
Definitely,
from Scotland.
definitely.
So I don't want to make a party political point here, and I don't have a vote in any Scottish election, so forgive me if I'm treading on any kind of contentious politics. But a couple of years ago, I was invited up by Inspiring Scotland to a round table about outdoor play, a round table discussion, and thought that's great, and I was really delighted to come up when we met. And I was really struck around that table were a lot of people with expertise in outdoor play, practical and some research experience, but also around that table was the Deputy First Minister and the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland. And that isn't something I've seen anywhere else in the UK. I may be being unfair to some other countries, but that level of engagement and interest, I think, says something about the value that's placed on, that was on outdoor play, but that's placed on childhood. And I heard a number of kind of stories and experiences of people there that suggested to me that within the Scottish system, there are people, not just the political system, but more generally within the Scottish systems, that there are people taking these things seriously. And that does have an impact. I think the messages that we send about what we value and the practical steps that we take, they're often tied in together. So that's just one example. The other example, again, I'm going to anonymize this, but you've seen some political leaders when they're discussing COVID, have question times that are for children and take questions from children. And again, that sends a message. It's only a message, and people can dismiss it if they want to. But those small things are examples of what makes a difference when we take children seriously and childhood seriously. And they then it means that we're thinking about it as one of our priorities. So I don't want to put too much weight on those things and say I'm not making a party political point, but it's those things that are signals that childhood is being taken more seriously that I think are important.
Yeah. I'm very conscious of time. We might be able to get through just a couple more questions. There's a great one here from Avril. How do you think play will change in the future? Will it decrease, diversify, or could we see a play revolution with more awareness on the importance of health and well-being in play? So how do you think it might change?
Predicting the future is a mug's game, isn't it? I can say what I hope, but it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. There are so many other factors that come into play. I say I'm an optimist, and so I by nature it's optimistic. So I do draw threads of kind of optimism from some of the things that we've seen change, and the kind of recognition that actually school and children's access to school and other things is something we have to prioritize. That feels in a way kind of new to me, but I hope that we can build coalitions that bring that evidence and that practice experience, and that we can find ways of influencing change. But that's a hope and an ambition, and obviously something I'm contributing and happy to contribute to, but it's going to depend on so many other factors. So I can't predict the future beyond that, but I think there's a lot to be gained by us going down that path. A lot to be gained.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Monica. What can we learn from research about growing family and community-led approaches so that everyone, adults and children, feel a sense of voice, agency, and our interdependence? So I think this is a great question, because it talks to a lot of the challenges. I know here in Scotland, for example, it's a big priority about how we ensure we're empowering and facilitating the right voices to be engaged in the issues that affect them. So what can we learn from research about growing family and community-led approaches so that everyone, adults, children, feel a sense of voice, agency, and interdependence?
That's a really good question, and any answer I give to it is going to be a bit inadequate. I think some of the really important stuff from that doesn't necessarily come from research. It comes from the experience and seeing it in practice, and valuing children's voices and family voices and building things up from the bottom up is one way in which you can make that change. Having the framework where the people with power are listening actively to children makes a difference. So that's where things like having children's commissioners whose job is to make sure that children's voices get heard in decision making, when that's operating well, and if that operates well, it makes sure that at least some children's voices are part of those decisions. And if we have those voices there, that then better decisions will be made. One tiny thing from I guess from research that I would draw on is that we can. I think people often feel like when they say we have to listen to children's voices, their default is go to articulate teenagers, and that's great, and teenagers should have a voice, but that somehow it's difficult or impossible to collect meaningfully collect the wishes of young children. But research, and some of that's done by colleagues of mine in other places, but one of my colleagues, Christina Fowley's done interviews with children even right at the start of school or before they start school. You can get meaningful opinions and views from children at a very, very young age if you do it right, and if you really value that. So we can do that, and I think we'll get better answers. Not that we have to do everything that children wish for, but having their input and their desires and their knowledge about what happens in their lives as part of that process of making decisions, I think has value that we really, really don't draw on at the moment enough.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm incredibly sorry to everyone. I'm aware there's 25 questions that we've not been able to answer. And I want to thank everyone who submitted a question. I'm sorry we've not been able to get to them. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative, if I may, to ask you to end the Q&A by asking you my favorite sort of Nesta question, which is, what is the question that you've not been asked today that you would love to answer?
I should come up with something really profound here, shouldn't I? And I'm really, really sorry because I'm not. I think I'd like you to ask me in a Swedish accent this question, if you would. And the context is, so the question I would really love to be asked in my life anyway, is that Paul Ramchandani tells me that ABBA have reformed for one final tour, and their last gig of the final tour and the final gig they're ever going to do is going to be either at Hampden Park or Royal Albert Hall. You take your choice. And the question I'd like you to ask is, Paul, we need someone to play the keyboards at our last ever gig. Can you please do it?
Well, I'm not going to massively offend anyone from Sweden by trying with my terrible Swedish accent, which is mostly inspired by the Swedish chef from the Muppets. But I think that's an excellent question. I didn't know you played the keyboard. Do you play the keyboard?
Very badly, and not of a standard that ABBA would ever want. But there you go. I can dream.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to be with us today and to answer those questions. We've rattled through an enormous amount of issues. You've given us an insight into some of the fascinating work that you're leading on. I hope that people who have attended today's session will be getting in touch with you. I'm certainly will. Yeah, I hope we can continue to keep in touch with you as well as we, as Nesta, look to what we might be able to do as an organisation in this space around how we might to support the equalising life chances, or how we might sort of be useful in the space of early childhood. So thank you, Professor Paul Ramchandani, for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who is an attendee for joining us and the excellent questions. Please do sign up to both our Nesta and our Nesta in Scotland newsletter. That way you can keep in touch about what's upcoming next. Our next Talks To event is at midday on Tuesday, the 3rd of November. Nesta's Director for Explorations, Celia Hannon, is going to be in conversation with Scott Smith, who is the founder of Changiest, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. And he'll be talking about his new book, How to Future. So for full details on that, you can look for events on the Nesta website, or you can sign up and subscribe to our newsletters, and that way you'll get prompts when they come up. So thank you very much to everybody for today. It's hugely appreciated. Thank you to Professor Ramchandani, and we look forward to keeping in touch and speaking to you all in the future. Thank you.